Welcome to the Thinking Stack.
Great to be here.
Today, we're tackling a big one. Not just economies, really, but, well, a full spectrum, 7-layer thinking stack showdown. Socialism versus capitalism.
A showdown. I like that. It's more than just labels.
Exactly. Think of it like a cognitive wrestling match. We want to pin down what these systems actually are, structurally beyond the usual hype.
Let's try to figure out what's actually true about these systems, not just what's assumed or, ideologically convenient.
Okay, round one then. That cognitive cleanse. Where do we start? Let's strip them down. Capitalism first, structurally. What are the absolute core components?
Okay, structurally. Capitalism hinges on the private ownership of the means of production.
Meaning factories, land, resources.
Exactly. The tools and resources needed to create goods and services.
Yeah.
And the big driver, well, that's the profit motive.
Right.
That's the engine. And then you have market signals, prices, supply, demand. They act as the main information system. They guide what gets made, where investment goes.
So it's decentralized mostly.
Largely decentralized, yeah.
Okay.
Allocation happens through competition, through pricing. And the underlying idea is individuals or companies chasing their own self-interest. Does that kind of framework make sense?
It does. Private control, profit motive as the guide. That feels like the essence. Okay, let's flip the coin. Socialism, structurally. What are its building blocks?
So socialism, well, it's fundamentally different. It centers on collective ownership of those means of production.
Collective meaning.
Yeah.
The state, the community.
It could be any of those. State ownership, community control, maybe worker cooperatives. The point is, it's not primarily private individuals or corporations.
Yeah. And the guiding principle isn't profit then?
Generally, no. It shifts. It's guided more by concepts like need or equity or sometimes, democratic planning. Profit becomes secondary, or it's deliberately redistributed for broader social aims. And essential goods, services, think healthcare, education, they're often treated not as things to buy and sell, but as public rights. What feels like the biggest shift there to you?
It's that move away from private ownership and profit being the absolute core drivers. It really does sound like a fundamentally different operating system.
It is. Now, an important point for everyone listening. You're not going to find a 100% pure example of either system just walking around on planet Earth.
Right. No purebreds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every nation is really a hybrid model, a mix. They blend elements. So the real question isn't, is this country capitalist or socialist? It's more about which elements dominate and what gets sacrificed in that specific mix.
What values take a backseat, yeah.
I think of it less like a switch, more like a slider on a spectrum.
Okay, so let's talk strengths. If we slide towards the capitalist end, what advantages typically pop up?
Well, the speed of innovation is often cited, isn't it?
Yeah, that always comes up. That relentless drive for profit seems to really accelerate development, new tech.
And the market's flexibility. It can react pretty quickly to changing demands, shifting resources around, even if sometimes maybe those demands are a bit manufactured.
True. What else would you add on the strength side?
Well, the incentive structures, when they work well, can be incredibly effective at spurring ingenuity, efficiency, in certain domains at least. Resources tend to flow, theoretically, to where they generate the highest return.
Theoretically.
Okay.
But then the weaknesses. What are the inherent downsides that often emerge in systems leaning heavily capitalist?
The big one, I think, has to be the potential for massive inequality.
Yeah, glaringly obvious sometimes.
When profit is king, wealth just tends to concentrate, and that can create deep social divisions, real fractures.
And what about things like pollution, the environment?
That's the externalities problem, right? The profit motive doesn't inherently factor in the long-term environmental damage or social costs that aren't priced into the product.
So the cost gets pushed onto society or the future.
Precisely. And then there were those famous boom and bust cycles, economic instability that can just wreak havoc on people's lives.
Okay, so instability, inequality, external costs. Now, let's flip back to socialism or systems leaning that way. Where do they tend to shine?
Often it's about providing a baseline of security, ensuring access for everyone to essentials, healthcare, education, things like that.
Safety net idea.
Exactly. You generally see lower levels of income inequality, a stronger focus on community well-being. There's often a philosophical stance, kind of decommodifying basic human needs.
Taking them out of the market.
Right. But again, the challenges. What are the common criticisms or difficulties observed in more socialist systems?
Well, that innovation question comes back, doesn't it? If the direct link between, say, individual effort and massive reward is weaker, where does that same kind of innovative spark come from? Is the incentive still there?
That's a key challenge. And then there's the potential for bureaucratic inefficiency, red tape, slowdowns,
Hurdles.
and particularly in more centralized versions, the concentration of state power. That's a definite risk, the potential for overreach, lack of accountability.
Okay, let's try and bust some myths, some of those simple slogans. You hear it all the time. Capitalism equals freedom. Is it really that straightforward?
Not quite. I mean, capitalism certainly champions economic freedom, freedom to trade, invest, own property.
Sure.
But does that always translate to overall freedom? The concentration of corporate power can actually limit the practical freedoms of individuals, especially workers, and huge economic disparities. Well, they restrict opportunity, don't they? That curtails real liberty for many. It's more complex.
So, market freedom isn't necessarily the same as human liberty across the board.
Okay. What about the flip side? Socialism equals equality. Does history just neatly confirm that?
History paints a Messier picture, let's say. The aim might be equality, but some states, calling themselves socialist, ended up creating new elites.
Right, based on political power instead of money.
Exactly. Political connections become the currency. So equal outcomes aren't guaranteed, and new hierarchies can definitely form. It's not automatic equality.
Okay, another one. Capitalism equals efficiency. Always true.
Well, efficient at what? It depends on how you define efficiency. If you ignore those externalized costs we talked about, the pollution, the social disruption,
Right.
then maybe it looks efficient in a narrow short-term profit sense. But if a system damages the environment or creates instability that requires massive public bailouts, is that truly efficient in the long run?
Good point. A narrow view can hide broader inefficiencies. Okay, last one for now. Socialism equals stagnation. Is that fair? Well, the Nordic countries seem to throw a wrench in that particular equation, don't they?
They do seem to manage both.
Yeah, they've blended quite successful market economies with really strong social safety nets, high public spending, and they're still highly innovative societies. So that simple duality, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's much more nuanced.
Okay, so pulling these initial thoughts together from this first round, this cognitive cleanse, what's the synthesis?
It really seems like both are, well, tools, powerful tools, but tools with built-in strengths and weaknesses. Capitalism is this incredible engine for growth, for generating wealth, driving innovation. But it can easily break social cohesion, lead to massive inequality, and ignore crucial long-term costs like environmental damage. It has blind spots.
And socialism.
Socialism prioritizes care, equity, basic security. It focuses on social cohesion. But it can struggle with dynamism, with efficiency, with creating incentives for that kind of breakthrough innovation. It can also concentrate power dangerously.
So neither is inherently good or bad, just different tools with different results and risks.
Exactly. They both have, as you put it earlier, their shadow and genius. And to really understand them, or to even think about designing something better, we have to get past just, waving the team flag. We need to acknowledge the trade-offs.
Okay, that's a good foundation. Let's move to another layer of the stack. What about the ethical dimension? Moral intelligence. Capitalism often waves the flag of liberty. What does that mean, morally speaking?
Morally, the argument for capitalism often centers on individual liberty, the freedom to choose, to trade, to innovate, to own property, to pursue your own economic destiny without undue interference, usually from the state.
The right to try and succeed or fail.
Right. And the underlying moral claim is that this individual autonomy, this freedom, ultimately benefits everyone through competition and innovation. But
does that focus on individual liberty sometimes ignore the starting line? People don't start equally, do they?
That's the crucial counterpoint. The ideal might be equal opportunity, but the reality involves inherited wealth, social capital, systemic biases. The playing field is rarely level. So that freedom to compete can feel pretty hollow if you're starting way behind with no resources.
Okay, so shifting to socialism then.
Yeah.
Its moral core often seems to be fairness or equity. How does that look ethically?
Ethically, socialism emphasizes that everyone, just by virtue of being human, deserves access to basic necessities: housing, healthcare, education. These shouldn't depend on your ability to pay or your market value.
It's about dignity, baseline well-being for all.
Exactly. The core moral argument is about society's responsibility to ensure that level of dignity and security for all its members, reducing suffering, ensuring fairness.
But again, looking at history, has that push for collective fairness always meshed well with individual freedoms?
That's often the central tension, isn't it? In practice, especially in more authoritarian forms, the drive for social and economic equality has sometimes led to significant restrictions on individual liberties, speech, movement, economic choice.
So how do you get fairness without control?
Well, that's the challenge. The social democracies, like in Scandinavia, again, try to navigate this. They use democratic processes, strong legal protections for individual rights, while implementing high taxes and strong welfare states to achieve greater equity. It's an ongoing balancing act.
So it's a fundamental difference in moral emphasis. Individual liberty versus collective fairness.
Yeah, you could frame it that way. The individual's right to strive versus society's obligation to provide.
But taken to an extreme, either one could be problematic, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Unfettered individual liberty without any social backstop. That can lead to a really harsh winner-take-all society, leaving vulnerable people behind.
A race with no safety net.
Right. And conversely, an excessive focus on collective fairness, especially if imposed top-down, can crush individual initiative, stifle dissent, and, ironically, create new forms of inequality or oppression.
So the ethical sweet spot is somewhere in between, trying to honor both individual dignity and collective well-being.
That seems to be the goal, or at least the challenge, for any system aiming for both prosperity and justice.
Okay, let's look further out. Systemic foresight. Thinking long-term, what are the recurring patterns, the likely trajectories we see emerging from predominantly capitalist systems?
Well, over the long haul, capitalism has shown an incredible capacity for wealth generation and technological advancement. That decentralized market mechanism is very effective at adaptation and, in theory, efficient resource allocation.
But the downsides over time.
The downsides tend to be a persistent drift towards greater inequality as capital begets more capital.
Right.
There's also the huge looming challenge of environmental sustainability. The growth imperative often clashes with ecological limits.
And the instability, does that smooth out?
Not inherently, no. Those boom-bust cycles seem pretty baked in. So looking ahead, you anticipate continued dynamism, continued wealth creation, but also ongoing risks of inequality, ecological strain, and periodic crises.
Okay. And the long-term patterns for systems leaning more socialist, what's their typical trajectory?
They often prioritize that foundational equity, which can foster greater social cohesion and stability over time. Universal services can build human capital, healthier, better educated populations.
But the risks long-term.
The risks can include potentially slower rates of innovation and overall economic growth compared to more market-heavy systems. And especially in highly centralized models, there's a vulnerability to bureaucratic sclerosis, becoming rigid, slow to adapt to new challenges or opportunities. Institutional inertia can set in.
So if capitalism risks crashing the car, socialism risks the car getting stuck in the mud.
That's maybe a slightly simplistic metaphor, but it captures some of the dynamic, doesn't it? Capitalism, dynamic, potentially unstable, unequal. Socialism, potentially more stable, more equal, but risks rigidity and slower adaptation.
Interesting trade-offs over the long view. Now let's bring it down to the individual. Embodied insight. How does living inside a primarily capitalist system feel? What's the typical lived experience?
Well, depending on the specific flavor of capitalism, it can often mean constant pressure. Pressure to perform, to achieve, to accumulate, compete.
A hustle culture.
Right.
Yeah.
And that can translate into chronic stress, anxiety about job security, finances. Burnout is a common theme. Your identity can get very wrapped up in your economic success, which feels precarious for many.
A sense of insecurity, even amidst wealth.
It can be, yeah. Now, what about the lived experience in a system with strong socialist elements, like a social democracy?
You'd expect, maybe. Less anxiety, more security.
Often, yes. A robust safety net, healthcare, unemployment benefits, pensions can create a greater sense of security, less day-to-day anxiety about basic needs falling through. That might free people up to focus more on community, personal development, things beyond pure economic striving.
But is there a downside to that feeling?
In some contexts, perhaps, particularly if it tips into overly bureaucratic systems, you might feel less individual agency, maybe sense of dependency or frustration with inefficiencies. It's not a universal feeling, but it can be part of the mix.
So, capitalism. Potential high-stakes anxiety and opportunity. Socialism. Potential security, but maybe less individual dynamism or more frustration with the system itself.
That captures the different textures, I think.
Okay. Human-centered design. Both systems are built on assumptions about people, about motivation. What are capitalism's core assumptions about human nature? And do they ring true?
Capitalism leans heavily on the idea of homo economicus, the rational, self-interested individual. It assumes we're primarily motivated by maximizing our own utility, our own gain, and that financial incentives are the most powerful levers.
And does that fully capture us?
I think most people would say,
Yeah.
not entirely. We are motivated by self-interest, sure, but also by fairness, by belonging, by purpose, by emotion, by habit. The purely rational, self-interested model feels a bit thin, doesn't it? It underestimates a lot of human complexity.
Yeah, it misses a lot of what makes us human. Okay, what about socialism's assumptions about human nature?
Socialism tends to place more faith in cooperation, altruism, our capacity for collective action, and concern for the common good.
And is that always realistic?
Well, we are capable of great cooperation and altruism, no doubt, but socialist models can sometimes underestimate the persistence of self-interest, the importance of individual incentives, and the challenge of what economists call the free rider problem.
Where people benefit without contributing.
Exactly. If the link between individual effort and reward is too weak, or if systems aren't designed well, motivation can lag. So both systems seem to operate on somewhat incomplete models of human behavior.
Neither gets us completely right. Interesting. Okay, risk and resilience. When the unexpected hits a financial crash, a pandemic, a natural disaster, how do these systems tend to cope?
Capitalist systems, especially the more decentralized market-based ones, can sometimes adapt quite quickly. Resources can shift rapidly, innovation can respond to the new need.
But the impact?
The impact can be very uneven. Those inherent inequalities mean crises often hit the most vulnerable hardest, and sometimes you see a pattern of socializing the losses, public bailouts, while the gains remain private.
Privatized profits, socialized losses.
It can look like that sometimes. Now, systems with stronger social safety nets, like social democracies, often show greater social resilience. They buffer the shock for individuals better.
The safety net absorbs some of the impact.
Right. However, highly decentralized socialist systems can actually be quite brittle. Lack of feedback loops, rigid planning. They can struggle to adapt effectively to sudden, unexpected shocks. Their systemic resilience might be lower.
So resilience looks different. Capitalism might be financially nimble, but socially fragile in a crisis. Socialism, especially social democracy, offers social buffering, but might be systemically rigid if too centralized.
That's a good way to put it. The type of resilience differs.
Okay, final layer before we synthesize. The execution engine, the real-world track record. What are the tangible results, the big lessons from how capitalism has actually played out across the globe?
Undeniably, it's been a phenomenal engine for wealth creation. Billions lifted out of extreme poverty, incredible technological progress. You can't ignore that.
But the cost?
The cost has often been huge increases in inequality within and between nations and significant environmental degradation. The pursuit of GDP growth doesn't always translate into broad well-being or sustainability. So the execution shows it delivers wealth, but often hoards it and harms the planet in the process.
And the real-world execution of socialist ideas. What's the track record there?
It's really varied. The authoritarian, centrally planned experiments of the 20th century often resulted in economic failure, stagnation, and severe repression of freedom. A grim record in many cases.
But that's not the only model.
Absolutely not. The democratic socialist and social democratic experiences, particularly in places like the Nordics, offer a very different picture. High living standards, low inequality, strong public services, vibrant democracies, all coexisting with market economy.
So execution matters hugely. The how is critical.
It seems to be everything. Those Nordic examples show it's possible to harness market dynamism while using strong democratic institutions and social programs to achieve outcomes like fairness and security. Pragmatism seems key.
Okay, so we've journeyed through these 7 layers. Let's try to bring it all together. What's the final synthesis? How do these two systems stack up after this deeper look?
Well, to quickly recap the layers. Cognitively, capitalism offers profit, clarity, but can be blind to wider harms. Socialism offers justice, clarity, but can be blind to coordination, complexity.
Morally.
Capitalism is freedom-driven, potentially ignoring fragility. Socialism is equity-driven, but risks control.
Foresight.
Capitalism creates innovation waves, but is crisis-prone. Socialism offers cohesion, but can adapt slowly.
Embodied experience.
Capitalism's hustle can lead to burnout. Socialism's security might risk numbness or dependency in some forms.
Human design assumptions.
Capitalism maps incentives well but can hack ethics. Socialism aligns with values but might misread motivation.
Risk and resilience.
Capitalism can be financially anti-fragile but socially fragile. Socialism can be socially buffered but systemically rigid.
And execution.
Capitalism built wealth fast but often broke people or the planet. Socialism, aiming for fairness, sometimes broke momentum or freedom in its flawed executions.
Wow. Okay, so the big takeaway.
I think it's that capitalism delivers wealth but tends to hoard it. Socialism delivers care but can sometimes kill the drive. We seem to need both the fire of innovation and incentive and the floor of basic security and dignity.
Neither's the complete answer.
Not in their pure forms, it seems. We need systems that reward effort and value creation, yes, but also punish exploitation and waste. Systems that protect human dignity, reduce harm, adapt quickly, and don't collapse under pressure.
Which suggests the future probably isn't about choosing one ism over the other.
Exactly. It's likely something more. Post-ideological. Something resilient, ethical, adaptive, borrowing the best tools from wherever we find them, rather than sticking to a rigid blueprint.
And it really comes down to design and execution, not just slogans.
That's where the rubber meets the road. Slogans die where thoughtful design and careful execution begin.
So maybe the provocative thought to leave listeners with isn't socialism versus capitalism, but
maybe. What do we need to design next? What system, what blend, actually fits the complex reality of the human condition and the challenges of the 21st century?
that requires moving beyond the flags and getting our hands dirty with the details.
It requires critical thinking, questioning everything, and focusing on outcomes, not just ideologies.
This has been incredibly clarifying, really cutting through a lot of the noise. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's a vital conversation to have.
Absolutely. Well, until our next exploration on the thinking stack, stay sharp, stay grounded, and maybe most importantly, don't let any single system define your soul.
Well said.
Next time, we'll be tackling something equally provocative. Why democracy is dying and might not deserve to be saved.
Ooh, that sounds challenging.
It will be. Join us then.